So as we mentioned at the beginning of this chapter, the majority of people think that language around addiction is neutral. So addict, abuse, clean, all the usual ones we hear are neutral. Cheered. But they're not. Those words quietly decide who is judge, who is helped and who is controlled, before anything else even happens, and we've shown that throughout this chapter. And if language is shaping the outcome, then everything built on that language is already biased. So if the words aren't neutral, what are they actually doing? Drugs and Addiction, an Anarchist Perspective, Dickie Dredd. And this is part 63 in the video series, and we're still on chapter 8, Propaganda, Fear and the Myth of the Addict. And this is the last part in chapter 8 before we move on to chapter 9. So, section 64, Towards Linguistic Liberation. Language remains the quiet battlefield on which every reform is won or lost. As section 61 demonstrated, the economy of stigma depends on words that turn policy into prejudice. To dismantle that economy, reform must begin not in law courts or clinics, but in sentence. The evidence is already conclusive. Portugal's decriminalisation model showed that changing terminology from criminal to citizen in care preceded dramatic reductions in death and harm, where speed softened, outcomes improved. Words do not merely describe reality, they configure it. As Fairclough observed, vocabulary defines the limits of thought. Every time a policymaker says clean, dirty, abuse or dependence, they reinscribe moral hierarchy under clinical disguise. Immediate reform is therefore linguistic as well as legislative. Journalists could remove criminal epithets from reporting. User becomes person who uses drugs. Addict becomes participant or peer. Clean and dirty vanish entirely. Health agencies might replace abuse with use and treatment compliance with collaboration. In law, neutral phrasing, already standard in Portugal, Switzerland and the Netherlands, could be adopted across UK and US policy. Each adjustment widens the space for empathy and precision, ensuring that the words of care do not reproduce control. As discussed in section 60, propaganda thrives on repetition. The same principle, inverted, can liberate. Repetition of dignity can overwrite the old spell of shame. Training programs for journalists, social work educators and police communications could institutionalise such change, using linguistic audits in place of punitive targets. University could treat language policy as harm reduction, a public health measure measured in respect rather than arrests. The anarchist tradition adds an ethical frame. Section 52 defined care without command as the foundation of horizontal medicine. Linguistic reform extends that ethos to communication itself. Speech becomes stewardship, the shared tending of meaning, rather than instruction from above. Words are no longer instruments of obedience, but instruments of relation. In this sense, linguistic liberation is not censorship, but consent, a collective agreement to speak without wounding. Hall reminded us that hegemony endures through vocabulary, the consent of the tongue. To withdraw that consent is to begin recovery, both civic and personal. Each reclaimed term restores agency to the speaker and humanity to the described. When the addict becomes the author and the diagnosis dialogue, the war on drugs loses its language. The chapter thus closes where the next begins. Chapter 9 expands this linguistic freedom into practice. Recovery defines not by renunciation but by relationship. Having reclaimed the right to speak, we now explore what it means to live in that speech, a politics of care conducted in plain language, free of command. So the problem was never just about drugs or behaviour. It was the language used to define them, words that quietly turned care into control, which means every policy, every treatment model and every public judgment built on those words carries that distortion forward. So if we've been speaking about addiction in a way that creates the very harm it claims to solve, what else has language shaped without us noticing? And if changing words changes outcomes, what happens when we stop speaking the system's language entirely? Next up, we move into Chapter 9, which is called Beyond Abstinence. And it was Section 65, Redefining Recovery, from Abstinence to Autonomy.